Russell's view, around 1911, he starts describing as logical atomism. And that view ends up being immensely influential. In fact, many people start identifying analytic philosophy with the thesis of logical atomism. And so I know certain people who think analytic philosophy died around 1950 because logical atomism, in effect, died. There aren't really logical atomists around anymore, although there are ideas here that I think continue to be influential. There's a lot to be learned from this. Now, what is logical atomism? Most directly, it's an attack on idealism. The idealist says, look, especially the kind of absolute idealists, Bradley, Bosanquet, others that he's discussing at the turn of the century, are people who think there is one object in the world. They're monists. There's one thing, the world, soul, the world, spirit, the world, mind, if you will. Everything is mental. Everything is a construction of, or projection of, or some aspect of that mind. And so there is really one immensely complex thing in the universe. Every time we say something, we're in effect isolating some aspect of that, and in that sense distorting reality, because reality is just this complicated, interconnected whole. And Russell here is saying, and by the way, he had believed in that up until about 1900, when he and G.E. Moore started thinking, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. How many people are in this room? How many things are in this room? Actually, let's start with that. How many things are in this room? Now that's a hard question, right? How many people are in the room? That's pretty easy, we can just count. How many desks are in there? We can count that. How many things are in the room? That's harder because we're not sure how to identify things, right? And so is the table one thing, or is the top of the table and the legs? Are they separate things? And we get into complicated questions. But ordinarily, if I said how many things are in the room, you'd say quite a lot, right? And you'd start counting up people and desks and projectors and folders and this type of thing. Now, suppose somebody said, oh, look, I know the answer without even looking at the room. One. It's the world soul. Okay, just more of the world soul. Go out in the hallway, what do you find? The world soul. Go to the bathroom. There it is, the world soul, et cetera, et cetera. Russell's at this point saying, wait a minute, that's ridiculous, okay? There is obviously more than one thing in the universe, or at least in common sense terms there is. So in part, he and Moore even writes a paper, Defense of Common Sense. He's saying, let's start with our ordinary way of using language, with common sense, with our ordinary understanding of things. And it's obvious there are lots of things in the world. Now, maybe by the end we'll be convinced by some sort of argument that that's wrong, but let's start there. We have here a thesis about methodology. And it's really what ends up being known as the method of analysis. He doesn't think he's starting with this. In fact, he credits Descartes for this. But you can see something similar going on in Aristotle. The thought is we begin by analyzing our thoughts, and especially analyzing the things we say. Aristotle, for example, in the Metaphysics, or in the Categories, is talking about what there is. It says metaphysics is the study of being qua being. It's an answer to the question what there is. So what is there? Well, being is said in many senses. Notice he immediately goes to language. Being is said in many senses, and then he says, what are the senses? It's used for substance and quality and quantity, relation, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, what is Aristotle doing? He is analyzing language into certain basic kinds, certain basic components, and then talking about what corresponds to them in the world. And that's what we're going to do here. It is to break down complexes, linguistic complexes, complexes in thought, and so on, into symbols. And once we think of it in those broad terms, we can realize, aha, this is just the kind of thing that Hume was doing, that Locke was doing, trying to break down complex ideas into simple ideas, complex impressions into simple impressions, and so on. And so it's something that you find among many figures in the history of philosophy. Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, Hume, etc. But this is specifically a logical atomism, where these symbols in thought or in language are going to correspond to things in the world. And so there is, to some extent, a metaphysical thesis here too, which is that once we get thought or language broken down into the symbols, then we can understand what there is in the world by seeing what the symbols stand for. Okay? Just as Hume said, the empiricist method is to break down the complexes into the symbols and try to understand the sources of things in simple ideas and simple impressions. So he's saying here, try to break down thought or language into the simple components and then see what they're doing. See what, if anything, they stand for. And so the thought is going to be that the world, too, consists of symbols corresponding to those symbols. And those things are independent of one another. They are not all one interconnected whole like this world mind. No, they're just independent things. Yeah?
Is that like similar to be like thing being ungrounded in metaphysics?
They're ungrounded? Well, in a certain sense they are. That's right. The absolute symbols are the things that we are acquainted with directly, and they are independent of everything else. So yeah, they are ungrounded in anything else. They're sort of the ultimate ground of everything else that we're talking about. Absolutely. Now this is a logical atomism. The form of the complexes is a logical form. And that's the other part of this thesis. So we break down the complexes into simples. You might say that's just the strategy of any kind of atomism. These are the atoms, these symbols are the atoms. But now, what's distinctive about logical atomism is that we do this in terms of a logical structure. We break down logically, in other words, things into symbols, not psychologically, as Locke and Hume have in mind, but we're talking about a logical structure here. And then, in the end, we break things down to the symbols that are independent of one another, and those things are the logical atoms, the basic units out of which everything else in the world is constructed. So how do we do it? In other words, we take thought or language, we break it down into its simple components, then we see them as standing for things that are in the world, and those are our atoms. These are the symbols of thought or of language, and here are the atoms in the world. Well, at this point, we have to think about what kind of language we've got and what its structure is. And so here, I think it's best if we stop and do a little bit of logic. Not very much, but just a little bit, because the structure of this has to be understood in logical terms. So suppose we are actually thinking about the world from a logical point of view. What kind of structure does it have? Russell has a logic, and at this point, he does not have a model theory. Model theory is something that's developed maybe for the first time in 1936 by Tarski. But that's actually a terribly unfair thing to say. The English translation appeared in 1936. He actually wrote it in Polish in, I think, 1928 or 1929. But since nobody but the Poles could read Polish, it took a while for these ideas to sort of seep out. So I'm being very, English-centric here and thinking of this as a 1936 phenomenon. But nevertheless, it wasn't until then that Tarski's ideas spread out. And Tarski comes up with a way of thinking about it, which is really there implicit in Russell. So I'm going to kind of take it over. Anyway, suppose we're trying to think about a logical language. We might think here is the basic form of a logical language. We have certain things that are, in fact, they're often called atomic predications. So they're the things of the form, I don't know, Q, A, let's say, where that's saying there's an object A that has the property or the quality Q. And then there are relational terms, things like R, A, B, where we are saying there's a relation that holds between A and B. Now we can get many of these. In fact, it's nice to think of these as sort of just unary monadic relations so that we can think of this as one kind of thing. But notice, what does Aristotle say? He says there are substances, something like these objects, and then they have qualities, they stand in relations. So these are the basic forms, Russell says. Now, when is this true? Something that says, in effect, A is Q. When is that true? This is not a deep question. Snow is white is true when what? Snow is white, yes. The book is green is true, if and only if. The book is green. Yeah, some of you could have said, oh, well, there is one and only one book. It is green. But thankfully you didn't do that. Yeah, what we do is end up saying, yeah, this thing. Now notice, A is a term, right? A is some linguistic item I've written here. But it stands for an object. And so we could think, okay, yes, terms like, I don't know, T in general, are going to stand for objects. It would be nice to have a name or a way of designating what T stands for. So we could do that, for example, by talking about the denotation of the term T. So let's do that. And similarly, if we have something that is a quality Q or a relation R, we could think about what it stands for. And so we could have some way of interpreting it. And so let's, gosh, do I really want to write all these D's? I don't want to write all those D's. Do you want me to write all those D's? I don't want to do that. Sure. Let's do something a little bit. You do? Yeah, let's just put a star to indicate we're talking about what that stands for. Okay, and here, then there could be the property Q star or the relation R star. And that's just whatever that term stands for, right? Terms like this that are ordinary predicates, for example, red, that's going to stand for some property, some quality in the world. And a relation R, like is to the left of, will stand for some relation in the world. Yeah?
But wasn't the whole point of Russell's earlier paper that like those qualities have no meaning apart from like their place in a sentence?
Many things don't have any meaning apart from their, but the atomic ones do. Basically, and you're right to say that something like DF contributes to the meaning of a complex. It is not itself a symbol. However, here we're talking about things that are symbols. Suppose this is a simple term T, a simple predicate.
Like the book is red, or green or whatever.
The being a definite description is not a symbol. But suppose I give this book a name. I call it Fred. And I say Fred is green. Actually, even calling the book Fred is a bit of a cheat. What the symbols are going to be ultimately here are little bits of experience. So right now you're about to have a sensory experience, at least if you look at the book. I say, that's green. And now I'm referring to that bit of sensory experience. That is really what the symbols are in the end here. This is a very empiricist theory he's giving us. But the basic idea of the methodology of the metaphysics doesn't have to lead there, it's just that he thinks it does. But yes, if I say, that's green, and I'm referring to that bit of experience, then that's a symbol. And so the term here, that, is going to be standing for some simple thing. Yeah?
How can you say that green exists in the real world in that sense? Because like our sensory experience is like necessarily a subjective thing.
Yeah, sure is. Yeah, I realize I'm staring stupidly at you, but the reason I'm staring stupidly at you is that in the end, that is actually Russell's view. That in the end, all that's really, and he says it, look, what I mean by green is not the same as what you mean by green. And actually it's a very good thing too, because he seems to think if we all meant the same thing by green, that means we'd have exactly the same things going on in our heads. And so there'd be no point to talking, because it's like our minds already agree. So in short, he goes in a direction that I personally find flaky here. And you're right, it will turn out what green applies to are not things in the world. Well, I can't say that. Not things in the external world like books and stuff. Really applies to these little inner experiences. And then what is an object like a book? It's a collection of those experiences. In fact, at one point he talks about Piccadilly. And, it's a street in London. But he says, what is Piccadilly really? Well, really, you might think about it and you have a certain set of images. Maybe I have one. Let's say Russell says, I've been there, I walked down it, so I have these images. Maybe you've never been there. And so for you, it's really just a very abstract thing, like place in London. Maybe somebody else says, well, I think it was part of Mary Poppins, and I saw Mary Poppins, so maybe Anyway, whatever image Piccadilly gives you, he says that's what Piccadilly means to you. And it's going to be different for every person. And really, if we're to talk about what Piccadilly is, it is some set of these sets of experiences. And so he says, I can't tell you what Piccadilly is. Well, without talking about classes and things like that, which is something that happens in lecture 7, which I did cut out so you don't have to read it. But yes, it turns out that the connection between any of these and anything we'd ordinarily call an object is extremely complicated. So something like green actually stands for these little bits of experience and not for things like books. Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're asking in your question for the week? That they just relates things to other things rather than grounding it like in reality? Or?
Oh yeah, my question is, yeah, often Russell's ontology here is described as a flat ontology, meaning there's no structure, we just get lists. At one point he says, really, metaphysics is a matter of inventorying the furniture of the world. And that just sounds like you get a list of things. And in fact, if you put it that way, it sounds like a really boring list. What, the metaphysician says, what is there? I mean, that's the first question of philosophy, what is there? You say, well, you know, there's this building, CLA, and here's this classroom in it, and there are these people in it, and these desks and tables, and okay, we finished that room, now let's go into the next room to do further metaphysics. And you might think, whoa, if that's what metaphysics is, that's really boring. It's just a big long list. And the question in a way is, does Russell allow you any structure, or in the end you just get an inventory? Like, let's say you're in a furniture store, and somebody says, you're an employee, and somebody says, do the inventory. You say, okay, we have 3 green sofas and 5 brown chairs, and that's, in the end, all you got. Or is there some kind of structure where some of these ground other things, some of these are made up of other things, etc. So, really, he gives you hints along the way, but it's going to be lecture 8 that will be crucial to answering that question. And I think, incidentally, here I do not have an answer. That is in my head and I want you to come up with it. This is really something like, I don't know. A lot of philosophers think this is utterly flat. You really just get a list, you get an inventory, that's it. Others are tempted to say, well, it's not really that flat, because some things are structured out of other things, and some things are complexes out of other things. And so that's what I want you to think about. In the end, do we just get a list, or does this distinction between simples and complexes allow us to do more? And I think you can defend either answer. But okay, so back to this. The idea is that if we take things into the simples, break down language into these simple components, then we can say, when is something like A is Q true? Well, that's going to be true, and so let's say the value of it is going to be truth, if and only if what? Well, the thing A stands for is, or really has, maybe we should say, the quality that Q stands for. And then what about this? When is the truth value of RAB truth? Well, if and only if now R, the relation that R stands for, really does relate A and B, the things that those terms A and B stand for. Now, what are these things? These statements that A really does have that quality Q, that A and B really do stand in the relation R. Those, he says, are facts. So what does the world consist of? Well, in one sense, it consists of these constituents, right? The A, the B, the R, the Q, that are the things the symbols stand for. But from another point of view, it's really the facts. And in fact, he says, look, you can't just inventory the things and inventory the qualities and relations and so on, because then you really do just get, what does the world consist of? Oh, Bob, Fred, Alice, Mary, and the qualities of, being nice, the relation of loving, etc. That doesn't tell me about the world. I need to know, well, who's nice, who's not nice, who loves whom. In order to understand this, I need the facts and the ways in which these relate, not just a list of the objects and relations and qualities and so on. Well, now those are symbols, and those are the facts, and then complex things are built out of those. So one thing that's tricky is, what about not? Suppose we have like not, P. When is the value of that truth?
When P.
Well,
Or why not P?
Yeah, when the value of P is false. Okay, when it's not the case that P has the value true. Now this is going to be one of the places where Russell thinks, ooh, wait a minute, when I'm thinking about these facts, do I need negative facts? And in these lectures, actually I've omitted the part from your reading where he discusses this, but in the end he says, I don't know. In 1907 in Mind, somebody published a paper where he said you don't need negative facts. Russell says, I'm not sure whether those arguments are right or not. I don't find them convincing. I'm still not sure. So basically, Socrates is not alive, right? That's going to be true if and only if it's not the case that Socrates is alive. If Socrates is alive, it's false. But now, is there a negative fact there? We've got positive facts in the world, but do we also have negative facts like Socrates is not alive? At this point, Russell's tentative about it. He says, I don't exactly see how to do without them, but I realize that sounds weird too, so I'd rather just have the positive facts. At another point, he says, look, I can't really say the only facts are of this form, because in the end you need the claim that these are all facts. And that, I think, is making a very important point. But we'll come back to that. Let's see more of how the structure goes. What about something like P or Q? When is that true? Well, if and only if P is true, or Q is true. What about and? Suppose we have P and Q. Well, if and only if P is true, and Q is true. Now at this point you might be thinking, this doesn't feel very deep. And I sympathize with that thought that somehow this feels like, so we're understanding or in terms of or and in terms of and so on, yes. But on the other hand, here's what's going on. We're finding complex sentences that we can say and saying, in the end, we don't need disjunctive facts. We don't need conjunctive facts. We don't need all these complex objects in the world that go along with the complexes we find. We can break them down into symbols. And so these are just very simple ways of breaking things down into the symbols. Now it gets more complicated than this. What about quantificational statements, like there is an F, right? So what about something like there is an F? When is that true? Now it gets much harder to say. Yeah?
That's where he talks about the problem of existence.
Yes, exactly. Later he talks about the problem of existence. And we've already seen a little bit of that on denoting when he's talking about everything and something and nothing and so on. But yeah, I mean, if we're really to write this out carefully, it can become complicated. I'm going to oversimplify here a little bit and just say one way of thinking about this. If we make the assumption that our language is a sort of ideal language, so that each object has one and only one name, we don't even really here need the only one. It'll be enough to just have the one name. Well, maybe that's not true. Let's pretend each object has one and only one name. Then we can say, if and only if there is, let's say, a constant, C, a name, in other words, C, such that the value of f of C is truth. Otherwise, we have to talk about objects in the domain. There would have to be an object in the domain that really was f. Okay? But we could do that too. That's what, in the end, this will give us on that assumption that our language is logically ideal. And then something similar for all. Then, for all constants C, this will turn out to be true. Or we could talk about all objects in the domain we're talking about. Well, all right, that's a way of breaking things down into symbols. Yeah?
Just quickly, that's because you say it's a constant because existence implies something that exists through time. Is that what that?
We don't have times in here yet. So, yeah, let's in fact catalog some things that are missing. Because so far we've got a basic outline of first order logic. We've got these sentential connectives like not, or, and. We've got quantifiers like there is, and we could easily enough define then all, and so on. But now what's missing? One is time. Okay, and that becomes crucial with something like Socrates is not alive. In fact, if I say Socrates is dead, that may be better. Because what does that mean? Russell says it means, well, Socrates was alive, but he's not now alive. And I need time to say that, right? I mean, I need to say there was some time when it was true that Socrates is alive at that time, and now at this time, he's not alive. And so I need times. And so far we haven't built that in. So what we're going to really have to do when this gets fancy is say, well, look, we're talking about things being true or false at a time, and that'll complicate things. What else is missing? Yeah?
Necessity.
Ooh, necessity. Yes, in general, all sorts of modality, necessity, possibility, contingency, etc. Those are missing. What else?
Conditionals, if then.
Yeah, conditionals, if then. Now there is a way that Russell does that, just defining it in terms of or and not. If P, then Q is just defined as either not P or Q. That is...
Wait, can't you
Wait.
can't you do it as VP and V not Q equals false?
Yeah, that would be an equivalent way of doing it. So one way of doing this is to say, look, this is just the same as not P or Q. Another would be to say it's not P and not Q. If you work out what those mean according to these definitions, those are equivalent. And this is called the material conditional, understanding it this way. That has some somewhat unintuitive consequences. For example, it means that not P will imply that this is true. Okay? So today is not Tuesday. So if today is Tuesday, I'm president. That feels false, even though it follows from the fact that today is not Tuesday. So either today is not Tuesday or I'm president. So if today's Tuesday, I'm president. Right? Why does that feel wrong? Because the day of the week has nothing to do. I'm not the president, and it doesn't matter what day of the week it is. So it feels like there's some connection being asserted there that's bizarre. Same thing true here. It's not the case that it's Tuesday, so it's not the case that it's Tuesday and I'm not the president. Well, again, that seems fine, but that's not going to be related to if it's Tuesday and I'm the president. So this seems stronger than these claims, and we don't have a good account of what that additional strength consists in. Are there other things that seem missing? Yeah.
I mean, is causation cause?
Causation.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, if I say this caused that, that's a perfectly good complex sentence, and yet it feels as if I don't have any way of representing that in my logic yet. So there are going to be a bunch of things that are omitted. And then there is one that he talks about, attitudes. Okay, things like belief, desire, and so forth. After all, suppose I say, I believe that I'm not the president. Well, that's true, but what kind of fact is that? Right? It looks like I'm related to a proposition. And in this case, you might say, gosh, I'm related to a true proposition that I'm not the president. And so it looks like, well, great. Maybe we could think of you as just related to a fact. So perhaps, he says, these things, and maybe it's true of causation too, we've now got relations among facts, or qualities attributed to facts, and so forth. And there might be all sorts of other reasons to do that. That's surprising. Might be, that fact is surprising, right? So I might need to do that in various ways. But so far, we don't have any way of